Okay, the last of lesson 31, the application portion of it, of how to get along with others. And to be honest with you, what this really is a review of what we've kind of gone over, what I can see from the stuff that I studied. Um, One of the challenges we have in living the Christian life, and I think we would all agree, is getting along with people. And no doubt, as I said, I think we would all agree with it. We meet people that's just sometimes hard to get along with, and we have to find a way to do that. Jesus understood this. So he taught much of this subject in the Sermon on the Mount regarding relationships. For example, all of this is in Matthew 5. In verses 7 and 9, he said to be merciful to others and to be a peacemaker. Verses 13 through 16, he encouraged each of his listeners to be a good influence. Think about people who have influenced your life. You hold them dear and near and dear to your heart. He said in verses 21 through 26 of Matthew 5, do not be angry with a brother, but to be reconciled to him. And in verses 38 through 40, Christ even spoke on how we should relate to those who would try to hurt us, our enemies. We're going to look at one of the entire sections of Jesus' teaching on how to get along with others. And it's found in what we've been studying for the last couple of weeks. Matthew 7, 1 through 12. And we're going to look at it maybe in a little bit greater detail. One of the things I hope that you'll take away from this course of study is that there are 6 truths that can be drawn from our text. We're going to call them 6 essential truths for getting along with others. Okay. Any questions so far? Thoughts? Okay. If you're taking notes, essential truth number 1. If we want to get along with others, Jesus first said that we must stop being what? Judgmental, right there in the very first verse. The passage begins, do not judge or judge not, depending upon your translation. Now, at first thought, this may seem like a negative way to start a section on relationships. But Jesus had his reasons. What do you think some of those reasons might have been? The way he started this, to judge not. That's right. As soon as you become judgmental towards people, they're going to not want to pay attention or be around you a lot of times. Um, and another answer to that might be that probably that all of us need this admonition. Okay, Jesus was meeting a universal need, and let's be honest with ourselves. Probably no 24-hour period goes by without each of us violating Jesus' command in Matthew 7, verse 1. I mean, think about it. Yes, Wayne.
We go right because we're not perfect judges.
That's right.
Jesus is perfect judge, but we're certainly.
Exactly right.
We know that nothing destroys a relationship more quickly than a failure to obey this one command. Maybe Jesus began with the subject of judging to offset a bad influence. Remember the scribes and the Pharisees? They were never far from Jesus' mind. They are always trying to find some fault to use in accusing him. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 5:20. He said, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. See, in Matthew 6, Jesus spoke of hypocrites. Those who sounded trumpets as they gave alms, who prayed on the street corners with endless repetition, and who wanted everyone to know when they were fasting. They wanted to be seen. That's why they did what they did, not to praise God. Jesus may also have started, as he did, to eliminate the negative aspect of relationships before getting to the positive. What I mean by that, remember we said before we plant flowers, what might we have to do? Pull a few weeds. Pull up a few weeds. The scribes and the Pharisees we've been talking about were guilty of this kind of judgment Jesus was denouncing. What did Jesus not mean in verse 1 when he said, judge not? Remember we talked about it. Did not mean civil judgments, right? Did not mean judgments concerning church discipline. That's important. It does not mean that we should never make judgments on other people. Remember what verse 6 talked about do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you into pieces. We need to be smart about sharing the gospel. Jesus here is warning us not to be gullible, not to be gullible. Remember what Jesus said in verse 15 and 17. We didn't really talk about that, only on that short occasion, about being aware of false prophets. What are we supposed to do when somebody comes in and starts preaching something that is unfamiliar to us? You have to correct them. You have to correct them. And you have to judge what they say is either true or false. Jesus expects it. Wayne.
In lesson 32.
Yes.
It talks about, but we have to be careful about judging who are the wolves and who are not the wolves.
Yeah, absolutely good point. We can have a different interpretation of things, and that doesn't mean it's wrong or it doesn't mean it's right. We need to be open to discussion. I lost my train of thought of what I wanted to say about that.
Worship practices and traditions,
Right.
more than they are scriptural based.
That's right.
And because someone doesn't use the same traditions in their worship does not make them wrong any more than it makes us right or wrong.
That's correct.
So we have to be very, very careful about the things we are judgmental about.
Exactly. And when it does come to judging, Jesus expects, in fact, he demands from us that we use what kind of judging? Righteous judging. Using God's standards to judge. And what does righteous judging not involve? Well, it does not involve using our prejudices, right? Our preferences, our bias. Doesn't include judging hastily until you have all the facts. Do not judge according to appearance. Remember that. And we do not judge what is inside a man's heart. We don't know. We don't know the motivation. We can only judge the action. Thoughts or comments? As a result of the negative approaches to judgment, we are sometimes harsh, bitter, hypercritical in our judgments when we should be tempered, or when we should temper our judgments with love and mercy, just like we want to have love and mercy shown to us. Thoughts, comments? Yes.
It boils down to too often we judge incidents rather than issues. Because somebody does something that may not seem right to you a time, doesn't mean that you become judgmental about it. Now, if it's repeatedly, and you know that it's against God righteousness, in other words, it's against what God teaches in the Scripture, then it becomes an issue, and that's what we are to judge righteously. But because we see something one time, or even maybe twice, doesn't automatically in and of itself make it an issue to be judgmental about.
And people see things differently than other people do. I mean, take a crime scene with witnesses. Think about how many different stories you might have, right? Yeah. People, I mean, generally you hope that everybody's kind of aligned, but there's going to be sometimes things said that nobody else says, and you're going, what? Yeah. Yeah, we need to remember a very critical, important promise that Jesus made to us in verse 2. And this should bring us to attention, if you will. We will be judged by the same measuring stick we use to judge others. That ought to send chills up your back. I hope as we read his promise, we see our need for mercy. Remember Paul's words in Galatians 6:7? We reap what we sow. So very true. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 10:8, and this is fitting, he who digs a pit may fall into it. Very, very true. Very true. And remember in the book of James, chapter 2, verse 13, for judgment will be merciless to one who shows no mercy. Scary when you think about it. Very, very much a warning to us. Any other thoughts or comments?
Jesus sums up some of this kind of judgmental attitude and warnings for it in Matthew 25, starting in verse 31. And it's not inspired, it's the final judgment. There's a scene there when Jesus comes down in glory, and he's there giving the final judgment to all those left on earth. And he's saying things like, I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. I was naked and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. And it goes on and on and on to list so many things that these people didn't do. And then their response was, when did we see you like this? And he says, if you didn't do to the least of these, let me just read it because I'm going to do it wrong. Then he will answer them saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, the righteousness until eternal life. This idea of judging, I get it, I see it. Immoral behavior and things of that nature, but to stop short of even giving or taking the gospel message to them, or even feeding them, feeding a sinner. I think we need to be careful.
Yeah.
And really try to do what Christ did.
I remember what I wanted to say about verse 6 in there about being street smart, if you will, not gullible around people. We need to, we need to be concerned that we are not judgmental in those who we think are deserving of salvation. Well, that person's such a sinner, I'm not even going to bother even to talk to that person. That's the wrong attitude to take. You try, and you may be booted out, but you do what Jesus said and shake the dust off your feet. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, Ben.
We used to have a preacher here years ago, and he would talk about that topic of judgment. And he knew the Bible. In the Bible, you're not supposed to judge, but he'd say I can be a fruit inspector.
Yeah.
So, in other words, you can make a judgment on what somebody's doing. I guess, for example, if you knew of somebody that was engaged in some sinful behavior, it's fine to say that's wrong. In fact, you should say it's wrong if you need to. But I think where you probably need to be careful is when you are saying it, when you're making your judgment on whether or not it's right, that you're not saying it in such a way that you're talking like you're just disgusted by the person that did it, or you're judging them, or you think you're better than them. I mean, you could say, well, I know that what they did was wrong, but it's kind of one of those not how you say it, but how you say it kind of thing.
Exactly. Never hate the person, hate the deed, right? And it's what we're talking about there in the fruit inspectors there in Matthew 7 and 17 and 18. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Fruit inspectors. That's exactly what we are, Jeanette. Yeah. That's right, because you're judging them. Yeah. I mean, I had an interesting thing happen tonight around, what time was it, 5:30 when the doorbell rang? I got up and I just opened the front door and have this metal screen door in front of me, and a young man was out there and he was campaigning. He was running for the school board here in Ripon for District 1, and his name is Jason Winter. And he very nice, very polite. Um, Gave me the brochure that he was passing out to everybody, and uh, you know, and just the way he carried himself, to what he said, I got a feeling about this. And one of the last things I said to him, I says, "Well, I appreciate very much this information. We'll look up your website, and uh, anxious to find out more what you stand for as far as education for our children and stuff." I said, "Just let me ask you, come right out and say, are you a conservative or are you a liberal?" And he got this funny little grin. He says, "Oh, I'm a conservative." And I just, you just instantly, I did anyway. I like the guy, so I'm going to follow up on it and find out more about him. And told him that we went to church here, and I emailed him. He gave me his email. I mean, on his card was a place to email. So anyway, never know. But first instincts, you got to get to know somebody a little bit. Any other comments? All right, essential two, truth number 2. And that is to make needed changes. When it comes to the need for change, we invariably prefer to look at others instead of ourselves. I mean, Jesus understood this when he said what he did in Matthew 7:3-5 about why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye? We went over that quite a bit, 3-5. Uh, yeah, we said this is somewhat humorous, but what Jesus was trying to tell us is that it is ridiculous to try to be judges when we may be in a worse condition than those we are judging. Okay? Examine ourselves. I'm sure Jesus was probably thinking of the hypocrisy, again, going back to the scribes and Pharisees, how bad they were. It's easy to see faults in others while ignoring our own. Think about that. Jesus wants us first to examine ourselves to see what changes we need to make. It's interesting that the Greek word, I may be pronouncing it wrong, but blepo, B-L-E-P-O, is translated to the word look, which means to scrutinize, to examine closely. Many commentators and some translators think that Jesus used the figure of a speck and a log because these items have the same composition. One is very small, the other is very large. Both are composed of wood. Now, the NIV says a speck of sawdust and plank, so that kind of ties it together. It's interesting, if Christ deliberately used an illustration with two items made of wood, then we have the absurd situation of a man with a log-sized sin acting superior to another one who has the same sin, speck size. Speck size. Paul wrote of this kind of inconsistency in Romans 2:1-3. He says, "Therefore you have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things and do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God?" How did Jesus characterize those who acted this way? He didn't mince words. Remember, he said, "Hypocrite." Verse 5, flat out, "You hypocrite." We've talked about what that means. It's interesting, if we constantly criticize others, we are implying that our record is clear, that our lives are right. Otherwise, we would not be qualified to judge, right? Jesus said regarding judgment, we must start with self. Start with self. He says, first, take the log out of your eye, he says. And then we can see to help our brother. We're not going to ignore him. We're going to help him. Because what does that do for he and I? It helps him, builds him up, restores him maybe. Relationships get stronger. All those are good, positive things. Good, positive things. We're told in many places in the Bible to test yourselves, examine yourselves, judge ourselves rightly. You know, it's interesting, even in the matter of self-examination, some common sense is in order. Now, we're not talking about a morbid obsession with personal failures, okay, and shortcomings to the point of, let's face it, self-destruction. We can be so hard on ourselves that we destroy ourselves. We have to learn to forgive ourselves. And sometimes that's hard to do. But nevertheless, if we are to get along with others, our first concern must be to make needed changes in our own lives. Any thoughts or comments? You see, if we start with self, we will be less disposed towards being judgmental of others. I like that. Makes sense. That's right. And that's what it takes. Notice the last part of verse 5. This is where we get essential truth number 3. I alluded to it a little bit. It, this is first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. We need to help others how? Humbly? That makes sense? Humbly. Absolutely. Humbly and with loving kindness. Compassion. Who hasn't been down that road of, destruction, so to speak, with things happening in our lives? We all have, I'm sure. If we really love someone and we see sin in their life, we will try to help them remove that sin. Right? That's what Jesus calls us and tells us to do. Jesus charged us to first remove the log, or the sin, if you will, from our own eye or life, and then we can see more clearly how to help our brother or sister. Many passages teach us this. Look at Galatians 6 and 1 and 2 real quick. Turn over. We kind of alluded to that earlier. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in spirit of how? Gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. We can also turn over to James 5. Yes.
Before that, in Galatians, the 5th chapter, patience and kindness and goodness, and all those are fruit of the Spirit.
That's right.
So when you behave that way, you are exhibiting or you are displaying the fruit that you are leading a spirit-led life.
Good point. Very good. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, all those things. Excellent point. James 5 and 19 and 20 tells us, brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone turns him back, look what he's done. Let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Multitude of sins. We all have sinned. We're all sinners. Everyone needs help spiritually at one time or another. So let us help each other, Jesus says. But as we do so, let us render that help with care and with said compassion. Again, it goes back to thinking about how we would like to be treated if we were in that situation. Respect, kindness, those things. Any thoughts on first 3 essentials? Essential 4, deal with the differences and difficulties. We have come to the verse, and we talked about it earlier about dogs and swine. Here is a puzzle. This verse seems to go against the spirit of what Jesus has been saying. Should we go around calling others dogs and swine? Okay. I think Christ put this sentence in for balance. We are not to be hypocritical, fault-finding, self-appointed inspectors of warts. I liked how that says. But neither are we to be gullible. God gave us common sense, and He expects us to use it in dealing with people. We are not to be callous, censorious, but neither are we to be careless or credulous. Remember, we discussed the nature of dogs and swine? Both were what? Ceremonially unclean. We remember that. To be called a dog was what? Very high degree of insult. It was a vicious insult, in fact. The pig was the epitome of uncleanness in the Jewish mind. Jesus said, in essence, don't waste your time on those who have no desire to hear the word, who continually reject the truth, the kind of people spoken of in Titus 1:15. Let me turn over there real quick. Titus 1:15 says, to the pure all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and conscience are defiled. Those who are defiled and unbelieving, having both their minds and their conscience defiled. Remember, Jesus told His disciples, again, as we talked about, shake the dust off your feet. Matthew 10:13-14. Thoughts or comments? $40 question. When do we make that decision to move on? Ooh, Charles. When do we make the decision to move on? On the first go around? Second go around? Okay.
Between someone who is teetering versus someone who just flat out, I don't want to hear it.
Get out of my face.
That's right. So you make that judgment when they reject the word that you're trying to share with them.
I agree. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, yes.
One of the videos that we watched, they had the guy asked what going on, I guess it was, and they asked if he wanted a Bible study. No, I don't want a Bible study. Okay, but you got any classes I could do at home? Yeah. We gave it to him, and he got it done, and we went back to him, and you want a Bible study? No, I don't want a Bible study. But I'll take another one of those courses. So he kept going, so he was on the fence, and he wasn't giving up on him.
Right.
But he eventually, for lack of a better term, I guess he kind of converted himself from the material that was given to him to his own study, but he was never given up. Right. So there's differences between somebody, I think he didn't really reject him. He rejected having him in his house, but he was still open to God. So different situations, we have to use common sense, and we have to fill the situation out. And different situations are going to call for different application.
That's right.
Wasn't there another one too where they were doing that and the guy kept saying no, and he kept offering him an invitation to come see the church, whatever, he just kept rejecting. It's like a year later,
Yeah.
he shows up at church and the guy started talking to him. He says, I'm ready for Bible study now. Yeah, so you never did. It's their time frame, and that's why one of the fruit of the Spirit is patience.
Yeah.
You have to be patient.
I think that may have been told many times, but I remember sharing that story about the neighbor who kept asking her neighbor to come to church. Oh, I don't think so. I mean, she's nice about it, but just not. Every Sunday, she was invited to go to church. After a year, she finally said yes, and the lady goes and says, "What changed?" And her answer was, "If it's that important to you that you've asked me every single week to go to church, then maybe I better pay attention." You know, my answer to this question I asked is it will vary from individual to another. And it will. You're just going to have to use common sense, and we got to pray about it. God will help us out. Any other thoughts on number 4 there? Essential truth number 4. Essential truth number 5, we talked about this. We need to rely on God, right? This brings us to the greatest passage on the power of prayer. What I want us to focus on is how these verses fit into the context of the subject we've been discussing, how to get along with people, right? We have learned that we are not to be judgmental, that we are to be merciful and kind. At the same time, it's been stressed that we are not to be gullible, right? We need to know when to shake the dust off our feet. These judgments are difficult to make. How can we keep from being tough when we should be tender? Or how to be tender when we should be tough? Verses 7 through 11 gives us this answer. Rely on God. Let me read that, please. Get back to Matthew. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds. And to him who knocks, it will be opened. For what man is there among you who, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, he will give him a serpent? And here's the clincher. If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Pretty amazing. These are great verses. God answers our prayers. Even as a loving father responds to the needs and requests of his children, so does God respond to us. This passage relates to our subject in several ways. For instance, God shows mercy to us, and that implies that we should do what? Show mercy to others. Exactly. What this emphasizes is that we can go to God with our needs. In fact, we have to. In this case, the need to know how to treat others. James 1:5, this is a great verse, tells us if we lack wisdom, what do? Ask God. Ask God. If we really want to get along with people, if relationships are important to us, then we'll spend much time in prayer asking for God's help to help us develop that relationship. Help us develop that. Any questions on truth number 5? Okay, number 6. Applying the golden rule. We spent all last Sunday talking about the golden rule. Verse 12 has been called, as I mentioned before, the high point of the Sermon on the Mount. It certainly climaxes the discussion on how to get along with others, right? In a sense, it summarizes it all that has been said in the sermon regarding human relationships, whether brother or enemy, friend or foe. Remember how some translation starts, therefore, or some say, in everything. Treat people the same way you want them to treat you. This is probably the universally best known statement of Jesus. A lot of people know that. Just think, this one simple rule, as I mentioned last Sunday, if everyone would follow it would solve all of the world's problems. It just, to me, it sends shivers up my spine. Most of us understand what the golden rule is talking about. The passage has reference to general truths that apply to all people. We all want to be treated with tenderness, compassion, so we need to treat others that way. We like to be appreciated, so we should express appreciation to others. We want to believe the best of us, right? People believe the best of us to put the best construction, if you will, on what we do. So we need to do the same to them. The list can be extended on and on. How many times have we said, boy, I wish that person would just understand me? You know? We want others to try to understand us, to cover our lapses in stupidity when we are that dumb. Cover it with kindness, to forgive us. So let's do unto others as we would have them do unto us. It'd be a wonderful world if we lived that way. I'll conclude with this statement. Mahatma Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, the influential leader in India, is said to have been greatly impressed with Christianity. He was especially impressed with the great teachings found in the Sermon on the Mount, including the Golden Rule. When asked why he was not a Christian, he replied sadly that he had not seen any Christians living by those principles. Do we live by the principles we have studied? I hope so. I hope so. Any final comments? Yes, Jack.
People. It doesn't say selected people. It says people.
Covers everybody. Covers everybody. Any final thoughts? All right. Well, next Sunday, Lord willing, Creek Don't Rise, Wayne will be doing lesson 32 on the straight and narrow, two ways of life. And I have thoroughly enjoyed your comments, and thank you for being a great class.